The grand ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers, their soft glow casting a warm elegance over the gathering of high-profile guests. The air buzzed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional sound of an orchestra playing in the background. It was the wedding of the year, a lavish ceremony for one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the towering floral arrangements to the diamond-studded invitations that only the elite had received. The groom, a man known for his sharp business mind and unshakable demeanor, stood at the altar in his tailored suit, a picture of confidence and success. His bride, breathtaking in an exquisite gown, held his hand with a radiant smile. Cameras flashed as guests whispered about how perfect they looked together. It was a fairy tale playing out in real life. But then, just as the officiant prepared to speak, a small, clear voice broke through the celebration. "Wait!" A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned, eyes scanning for the source of the interruption. And there she was, a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, standing near the front of the aisle. Dressed in a simple white dress, she looked out of place among the extravagance surrounding her. Her big, innocent eyes were filled with determination as she clutched a small envelope in her tiny hands. The bride's smile faltered. The groom stiffened. Murmurs rippled through the guests, confusion spreading like wildfire. Who was this child? And why had she interrupted the most important moment of the CEO's life for a moment? No one moved. The girl hesitated, glancing up at the groom with a mix of fear and resolve. Then, taking a deep breath, she spoke again, her voice trembling but firm. "I have something to say." The silence grew heavier. The officiant looked at the groom, unsure of what to do. The bride's hand tightened around his arm. Someone in the back whispered, "Who is she?" The groom's jaw tensed. His eyes darkened, flickering with something unreadable. But before he could respond, the little girl lifted the envelope. "This is for you," she said, her small hands shaking as she held it out. The guests watched, stunned, as the groom hesitated. His hesitation wasn't just surprise, it was something deeper. A flicker of recognition passed through his expression, too brief for most to catch. The bride glanced at him, confusion replacing the joy on her face. One of the wedding planners hurried forward, attempting to gently usher the girl away, but she didn't budge. "Please," she insisted, her voice barely a whisper now. "You need to read this." The tension in the room was unbearable. The once festive atmosphere had shifted, replaced by an eerie uncertainty. What was inside that envelope? Why was this little girl so determined? And, most importantly, why did the groom look like he already knew what was coming? No one could have expected what happened next. That moment felt like time had stopped. The weight of 100 silent stares pressed down on the little girl. But she didn't back away. Her tiny fingers trembled as she held the envelope higher. Her wide eyes locked onto the groom. The bride's grip on his arm tightened. She whispered something to him, but he didn't react. His gaze was fixed on the girl, his face unreadable. A soft cough from the officiant reminded everyone that this was still a wedding. The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Someone in the back chuckled awkwardly, expecting the scene to end any second now, but the girl didn't move. A woman from the crowd, one of the wedding planners, hurried toward her, kneeling down to her level. "Sweetheart, this is a wedding. Maybe you can give that to him later." Her voice was gentle, but there was an unmistakable urgency behind it. She was trying to smooth things over before the moment turned into a scandal. The girl shook her head. "He has to read it now." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to silence the whispers again. The groom finally exhaled, his lips pressing into a thin line. He reached out, hesitating just before taking the envelope from her hands. His fingers brushed against the paper, and for a brief second, he seemed frozen. The girl watched him closely, as if waiting for a reaction. The bride's patience cracked. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice tight. "Who is she?" No one answered. The groom's hand clenched around the envelope. He glanced at the little girl again, and for the first time, something flickered in his expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion. It was something much harder to define. The little girl took a step back, as if her part was done. She looked up at the wedding planner beside her and whispered something. The woman's face changed, her polite smile fading into something closer to shock. What did she say? The planner hesitated, but before she could respond, the groom finally spoke. "I'll read it later." His voice was controlled, but his grip on the envelope was tight enough to wrinkle the paper. The little girl shook her head. "You have to read it now," she insisted. A wave of discomfort rolled through the crowd. This was no ordinary wedding mishap. This wasn't a misplaced speech or a forgotten ring. There was something more going on here, something none of the guests had expected when they walked into this glamorous ballroom. The bride's expression hardened. "I don't understand what's happening right now," she said, her voice cool. "But I'd like to." She turned to the groom, her perfectly styled hair barely moving as she did. "Who is she?" The question hung in the air. The groom didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the edge of the envelope, his mind clearly somewhere else. Finally, he looked down at the little girl. His voice was quiet but firm. "Who sent you?" The little girl swallowed, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "She told me to give this to you," she said softly. "She said you'd understand." The guests exchanged confused glances. She? Who was she talking about? The bride folded her arms, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "You're being very cryptic," she told the groom, her voice tinged with frustration. "Either explain or—" But before she could finish, the groom slid a finger under the flap of the envelope and tore it open. The sound was deafening in the silence of the room. A single piece of paper lay inside. He pulled it out, unfolding it slowly. His eyes scanned the words, his face carefully blank. But something changed in the way he stood. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched just slightly. The bride was watching closely. "What does it say?" The groom didn't answer. He read the note again, slower this time, as if making sure he hadn't misunderstood the little girl, who'd been holding her breath, finally spoke. "She said you'd know what to do." The groom's fingers curled around the note. The air in the room felt heavier, the mood shifting into something almost unbearable. The bride stepped forward. "Let me see it," but he didn't hand it to her. Instead, he folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "Not here," he said under his breath. The bride blinked. What? The groom exhaled sharply. "I'll explain later." That was the wrong answer. The bride's lips parted in shock, then pressed together in barely restrained anger. "No," she said firmly. "You'll explain now." The guests were hanging on to every word. No one dared to move. The little girl, still standing close, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes on her. The groom finally turned to the officiant, his expression unreadable. "I need a moment," gasps rippled through the crowd. The bride's face paled. "You need a moment," she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. The groom looked at her, and for a brief second, something almost like regret flashed in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The note still in his pocket, the bride stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. The little girl watched him go, her face unreadable, and just like that, the perfect wedding had unraveled in front of everyone. The groom's polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as he walked out of the ballroom, his posture tense, his pace quick. The note in his pocket felt heavier than it should have, as if the words written on it carried a weight he wasn't ready to bear. The whispers behind him grew louder, the guests unable to contain their shock. The bride stood frozen at the altar, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. The perfect night she had imagined was slipping through her fingers, and she had no idea why the little girl remained where she was, watching him disappear through the grand double doors. She looked down, her small hands twisting the fabric of her dress. She had done what she was told. Now it was up to him. The wedding planner, trying to salvage the moment, stepped forward with an apologetic smile. "Everyone, please, let's give the couple a moment. There's still plenty to celebrate," but the bride wasn't listening. Without hesitation, she lifted the hem of her gown and stormed after the groom in the hallway. The groom finally stopped, his back against the cool wall. He unfolded the note with shaky fingers, reading the words again. Each letter felt like a punch to the gut. The handwriting was unmistakable. "You promised me." The words were simple, but they held years of unspoken meaning. A chill ran through him. His mind raced, memories clashing against the present. Then came the voice behind him, sharp, demanding. "What is going on?" He turned. The bride stood there, her eyes flashing with something between anger and desperation. "I need to know." He hesitated. "It's complicated." Her laughter was short, humorless. "No. What's complicated is that I was just left standing at the altar while my fiancé walked away without a word. And it had something to do with that little girl." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Who is she?" He exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I don't know." She scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" He didn't respond. His mind was still racing. The little girl had mentioned her. That could only mean one thing. But how? How was this happening now, of all times? The bride studied his face, looking for answers. Then something clicked. Her voice dropped even lower. "Did you know her mother?" His jaw tightened. That was all the answer she needed. Her breath caught. "Oh my God. I need to handle this," he said. "Please." "Please?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You're asking me to wait while you handle what? A secret child showing up at our wedding?" He clenched his fists. "It's not like that." "Then explain it to me," she shot back. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain something he himself didn't fully understand? The note burned in his hand. "I have to go," he finally said. Her expression hardened. "Go where?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away. She watched him go, her heart pounding. A bitter realization settled over her. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was something big, something that had the power to change everything back in the ballroom. The guests tried to pretend nothing had happened. The music played again, but it was hollow, a weak attempt to restore the celebration. The little girl stood near the corner now, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress. She could feel the stares, the whispers. Then a soft voice came from beside her. "Are you okay?" She turned. A woman, one of the guests, knelt beside her, offering a kind smile. The girl nodded hesitantly. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" The woman asked gently. The little girl lowered her gaze. "She's not here." The woman hesitated. "Do you know the man you gave the letter to?" The girl thought for a moment, then nodded. "He knew my mom." That answer sent another ripple of unease through the air. The woman glanced around, as if trying to decide whether to press further. Before she could, the bride re-entered the room, her expression unreadable. Her eyes immediately locked onto the little girl for a long moment. They just stared at each other. Then the bride walked over, lowering herself so they were at the same level. Her voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it. "Who sent you?" The little girl hesitated, then whispered, "My mom." The bride swallowed. "Where is she?" The little girl's eyes filled with something unspoken. "She said you wouldn't see her again." The bride felt something twist inside her. She didn't understand the full story yet, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just a mistake. This was the beginning of something much bigger. And she wasn't going to stop until she knew the truth. The bride felt her pulse quicken as she looked into the little girl's eyes. There was something haunting about the way she spoke, too calm, too certain for someone so young. It sent a chill through her. The room was still, but the weight of unspoken words pressed down on everyone. The guests pretended to sip their drinks, their ears straining to catch any new details. The wedding planner, shifting nervously at the side, glanced between the bride and the girl, unsure if she should intervene. The bride's voice was softer this time. "What do you mean we wouldn't see her again?" The little girl hesitated. She said she had to go away. The bride's stomach tightened. Go where? The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out another folded piece of paper. It was smaller than the first letter, slightly crumpled, as if she had been holding onto it for a long time. She extended it toward the bride. "This one's for you." The bride stared at it. A part of her didn't want to take it. She already knew deep in her gut that whatever was written on that paper would change everything. But she had to know. She slowly reached out and took it. As she unfolded it, she felt her hands tremble. Her eyes scanned the words, and her breath hitched. "I never wanted to do this to you. But you needed to know the truth." The bride's fingers tightened around the paper. Her vision blurred for a moment, the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. She looked up at the little girl. "Who wrote this?" The girl didn't answer. A hand touched the bride's arm. She turned to see one of her bridesmaids, her face filled with concern. "Do you want to sit down?" she asked in a hushed voice. The bride shook her head. She turned back to the girl. "Is your mother?" She swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "Is she okay?" The girl's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, finally, she whispered, "I don't know." A shiver ran through the bride. The doors to the ballroom swung open. The groom was back. His presence sent a fresh wave of tension through the room. His face was unreadable, his posture stiff. He had clearly spent the last few minutes trying to compose himself, but there was something different in his eyes. Something fractured. He walked toward them, his eyes locked on the little girl. The bride watched as he stopped just a few feet away. He didn't speak immediately. Then carefully, he crouched down so he was at eye level with the girl. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Who brought you here?" The little girl hesitated before answering. "A friend of my mom's." The groom's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Where is this friend now?" The girl glanced at the doorway, then back at him. She said she couldn't stay. The bride watched his expression shift just slightly, but enough. He was piecing something together, but she wasn't sure what. She stepped forward. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice firm but quiet. "You know who her mother is, don't you?" The groom's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. The bride felt her heart hammering. "Who is she?" he exhaled slowly. "Someone from my past." "That's not an answer." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if weighing whether he should say more. The little girl suddenly spoke, her voice breaking the moment. "She said you'd be mad." The bride turned to her. "Who, my mom?" the girl said softly. "She said you wouldn't understand." The bride's chest tightened. Understand what? The little girl looked between them. Then carefully, she whispered that he loved her first. The words hit like a crashing wave. The room felt like it had been knocked off balance. The bride sucked in a sharp breath. The guests were frozen, waiting, barely daring to move. The groom closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. And that was when the bride knew this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just some forgotten relationship from years ago. This was something bigger. Something unfinished. Something that had been buried until now. The tension in the air was suffocating. The bride clenched her fists, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything." The groom opened his mouth, and then a voice from the entrance cut through the silence. "You should hear it from me." Everyone turned. A woman stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, and the room erupted in whispers. The murmurs in the room swelled like an incoming storm. Every pair of eyes locked onto the woman standing in the doorway. The bride's breath caught in her throat as she took in the stranger's face. Or was she a stranger? There was something unsettlingly familiar about her. The way she stood, the way her gaze flickered toward the groom, as if she already knew how he would react. The groom's entire body stiffened. His face, already tense, became unreadable. His hands curled at his sides, but he didn't move, didn't speak. The little girl, still standing close, let out a soft breath, one that seemed too heavy for someone so small. The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, a sound too sharp in the suffocating silence. Her eyes settled on the bride first, scanning her carefully, then shifted to the groom. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but laced with something unshakable. "I'm sorry it had to be like this," she said. "But you left me no choice." The bride's pulse pounded in her ears. "Who are you?" The woman's lips parted slightly, almost as if she had expected a different question. But instead of answering right away, she looked at the groom. "Tell her," she said softly. "Or should I?" The bride's patience snapped. "Tell me what." The groom swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. He finally turned to the bride, but his eyes weren't steady. He looked afraid, and that terrified her more than anything. "I thought you were gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression didn't change. "I was." The bride's heart pounded harder. "Gone? What does that mean? What is happening right now?" The woman finally shifted her gaze back to her. "He never told you, did he?" she asked. "About us?" The bride's stomach twisted. Her voice came out hoarse. "You're the mother, aren't you?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the little girl, who was staring at the floor, avoiding everyone's eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "Yes." A wave of something unreadable crashed over the bride. Her head spun, the weight of this truth pressing against her ribs. The groom exhaled shakily, his hands running through his hair. "You were gone," he said again. More disbelief. "You?" He stopped himself, shaking his head, as if he couldn't trust his own thoughts. "You disappeared." The bride's breath hitched. "Disappeared?" The woman tilted her head slightly. "That's what you tell yourself?" she asked. "That I just disappeared?" The tension in the air sharpened. The bride looked between them, realization dawning in fragments. This wasn't just a lost love. This wasn't just a secret child. This was something more. "You thought she was dead," the bride whispered. The words tasted foreign in her mouth, like she didn't quite believe them. But the way the groom's expression faltered, the slight, involuntary flinch, told her everything. The guests, already shocked beyond belief, barely breathed. This was no longer just wedding gossip. This was something none of them had expected to witness. The woman let out a quiet sigh. "Not dead," she said, "but close enough." The groom's face paled. The bride clenched her fists, her mind racing. "Someone explain this to me. Now?" The woman looked at her, really looked at her this time, as if seeing her for the first time. Then she turned back to the groom. "Tell her," she repeated. His hands trembled at his sides. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His entire world was unraveling right in front of him. So she spoke for him. "You were told I died," she said, voice steady. "Weren't you?" The bride stared at the groom, waiting. Finally, after what felt like forever, he gave the smallest nod. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bride stumbled back a step, gripping onto the nearest chair for support. "That's not possible." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "It is. It is." The room had never felt heavier. The air was thick with confusion, disbelief, fear. The bride shook her head. "Why?" she demanded. "Who told you she was dead?" The groom inhaled sharply, as if just now realizing the same question. His hands clenched, his mind racing back years maybe. The puzzle pieces that never quite fit together. The things that never made sense. "I don't know," he whispered. The bride let out a bitter laugh, her emotions unraveling. "You don't know?" The woman watched him carefully. "Maybe you should start asking." His breath caught. The bride turned to the woman again. "If you weren't dead, where were you?" The woman hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. The bride's stomach twisted. "You don't want to know," the woman finally said. The groom's face darkened. "Tell me." She held his gaze. "Are you sure?" He didn't flinch. "Tell me." A beat of silence. Then, I was taken. The entire room froze. The bride's breath caught. The groom's fingers curled into fists. The little girl, still silent, shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean, taken?" the bride asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression remained unreadable. "I mean exactly what I said," the groom's heart pounded. By who? The woman studied him for a long moment before answering. "By someone who didn't want me coming back." The world seemed to tilt. The bride's throat went dry. "Who?" The woman exhaled slowly. "You already know," she murmured. The groom shook his head, his mind rejecting it, refusing to process what she was saying. The bride, however, wasn't so sure. A horrible thought crept into her mind. A thought she didn't want to believe. She turned to the groom. "Who knew she was gone?" she asked. "Who told you she was gone?" His breath hitched. He knew exactly who had told him, and for the first time since the little girl walked into the room, real fear flickered in his eyes. Because if what this woman was saying was true, then everything he thought he knew about his past, about his family, about his own life, was a lie, and the person who told it someone he had trusted. The weight of the truth loomed over him, suffocating, inescapable. The woman took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper now. "Are you ready to know?" The groom's breathing was unsteady. His mind raced through memories, through every conversation, every assumption he had accepted as truth. The weight of the woman's words pressed down on him, each syllable peeling away another layer of the life he thought he knew. His chest tightened as he turned toward her, his voice hoarse. "Tell me." The woman's gaze didn't waver. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Before she finally spoke, "It was your father." The words landed like a blow. The room seemed to shrink around him, the murmurs of the guests fading into a dull hum. His father. The man he had idolized. The man who had shaped him, guided him, stood beside him at every major moment in his life, including today, at his wedding. The groom's hands clenched at his sides as he struggled to The bride stared at the groom, watching his face drain of color. The little girl, still standing near her mother, lowered her gaze as if she had already known this truth. The guests exchanged glances, whispering among themselves, their shock barely contained. The groom took a step back, shaking his head. "No," he muttered. "That doesn't make sense." His voice was shaking, but he didn't care. Why would he? He stopped himself, but the question hung in the air, unanswered. The woman inhaled deeply, as if bracing herself for what she was about to say next. "Because I wasn't supposed to be in your life." The bride frowned. "What does that mean?" The woman looked at her, then back at the groom. "He decided I wasn't the right person for you. That I was a distraction, a mistake. And he didn't just want me gone, he wanted me erased." The groom felt his stomach turn. His father had always been controlling, always had a way of steering things in the direction he wanted. But this wasn't just manipulation. This was something else entirely. The woman's voice softened. "I didn't leave you. I didn't disappear. I was taken. Your father made sure of that." The realization slammed into him all at once. All the missing pieces, all the strange moments that had never quite made sense. The way his father had consoled him, but never seemed surprised. The way no one had ever truly searched for answers. He had spent years grieving, believing he had lost someone he loved. But his father had never grieved, because he had known. The groom turned toward the far side of the ballroom, searching. His father had been there just moments ago, standing among the other guests, watching everything unfold. But now he was gone. His stomach sank. The bride followed his gaze and felt the same dread settle over her. "Where is he?" she whispered. The room felt colder. The weight of the truth pressed down on all of them, but the man who held the final answers had disappeared. The woman's voice cut through the tension. He ran. The groom didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel, moving swiftly toward the exit. The bride followed, her heart hammering in her chest, and the woman and the little girl trailed behind them. The guests stood frozen, unsure if they should stay or follow. The hallway outside was empty, the air thick with an eerie stillness. The groom's hands curled into fists as he scanned the space, searching. Then a flicker of movement near the back entrance. He took off the footsteps behind him, told him the others were following, but he didn't slow down. His breath was ragged, his pulse pounding. The weight of betrayal fueled every step as he pushed forward, rounding the corner. And there he was. His father stood at the edge of the parking lot, his back to them, his shoulders tense. He wasn't moving, as if he knew he had nowhere left to run. The groom slowed, his footsteps heavy as he approached. "Why?" His voice came out raw, broken. His father exhaled, finally turning to face him. His expression wasn't one of guilt, but something else. Resignation. "I did what I had to do." He said simply. The words sent a fresh wave of anger through the groom. "You lied to me. You took her from me." His voice cracked, but he didn't care. "You let me think she was dead." His father's expression didn't change. "It was for your future." The bride felt her breath catch at the coldness of his words. She moved closer, standing beside the groom. "How could you do that to your own son?" she asked, her voice shaking. His father's gaze flickered to her. "Because he wouldn't have had the life he has now if I hadn't." The woman stepped forward, her voice tight with controlled fury. "You destroyed a life that wasn't yours to control." His father didn't deny it. He simply looked back at the groom. "I built everything for you," he said. "I gave you this life. I made sure you had everything you needed." The groom's hands trembled. "You took her from me." His father's jaw tensed. "She was a distraction. You wouldn't be standing here today, a powerful man, about to marry into an even more powerful family, if I hadn't done what I did." The bride felt sick. The groom let out a shaky breath, his anger burning through him. "You don't get to decide what's best for me." His father's expression finally wavered. But before he could respond, the woman spoke again, her voice sharper this time. "What happens now?" The groom turned to her, realizing what she was really asking. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about what came next. The bride swallowed hard. "You can't just walk away from this," she said, looking at the groom's father. For the first time, his father looked unsure. His carefully built world had crumbled. He had played the game for so long, controlling everything from the shadows. But now, the truth was out. And there was no going back. The groom straightened. "You're going to tell the truth," he said. To everyone, his father's expression darkened. "You're going to admit what you did," the groom continued, his voice stronger now. "And then you're going to walk away. From me. From my life. For good." His father stared at him, searching for any hesitation. But there was none. Finally, after a long silence, his father nodded once. It wasn't remorseful. It wasn't an apology. But it was an acknowledgement. The tension in the air remained thick as he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The groom let out a slow breath, his entire body feeling lighter, freer than it had in years. He turned back to the woman, his gaze softer. "Now I thought I lost you," he whispered. She gave him a small, sad smile. "I thought I lost you too." The little girl shifted closer, looking up at him with wide eyes. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The bride watched, her emotions a storm inside her. So much had changed in a single night. She met the groom's gaze. "What now?" he exhaled, then looked back at the woman and the little girl. A lifetime had been stolen from them. But now, they had a choice. His wedding was supposed to be the start of a new chapter. And maybe, just maybe, it still could be, but the ending would be different from what he had ever imagined. That night, long after the guests had left and the ballroom had emptied, the groom sat alone in the dim light of the venue. The weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on his chest. His father was gone, not just physically, but from his life. The truth had unraveled everything he thought he knew, leaving behind an emptiness he didn't yet know how to fill. Footsteps approached, quiet but certain. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. The woman sat beside him, close but not too close. There was so much to say, yet neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was full, brimming with all the emotions words could never fully express. She sighed softly. "Are you okay?" The groom let out a small, humorless chuckle. "I don't know." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I should be angry. I am angry. But mostly, I just feel lost." She nodded, understanding. "Your whole world shifted in one night. It's okay not to know what to feel." He turned to her then, really looking at her. The years apart had changed them both, but in her eyes he still saw the same person he had once loved, the person he had mourned for so long. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. She gave him a small smile. "Maybe it doesn't have to be fixed. Maybe it just has to be lived." The little girl stood a few feet away, watching them with quiet curiosity. She had been so brave, standing up in front of all those people, speaking a truth she knew would change everything. He hadn't had a chance to process what that meant for them, for her, for him, for all of them carefully. He turned to the little girl. "Do you want to sit with us?" She hesitated for just a moment before walking over, settling between them. She didn't say anything, just rested her small hands in her lap. The groom studied her, noticing the little things, the way her nose scrunched when she was thinking, the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her dress. "She's brave," he said softly. The woman smiled at her daughter. "She is. The little girl looked up at him then, her gaze steady. "Are you mad at my grandpa?" she asked, her voice small but strong. The groom inhaled slowly. It was such a simple question, but the answer was anything but. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think I should be." The little girl nodded, as if she understood. "Mom says sometimes people do bad things because they think they're helping." He looked at the woman beside him, who gave a small shrug. "She's observant," he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't think what he did can ever be excused." The little girl tilted her head. "But are you mad?" He thought about it. Really thought about it. And then he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I'm just sad." The little girl reached out, hesitantly placing her hand over his. It was such a small gesture, but it grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. He looked at her, really seeing her now. "I don't want to rush this," he said to the woman. "There's too much history, too much we need to understand. But if you're willing," he hesitated. "I want to try." The woman's eyes softened. "I think that's all we can do." The bride stood in the doorway, watching them. She had given him space. No. But watching him now, seeing the quiet shift in him, she knew something had changed. She stepped forward, clearing her throat gently. The groom looked up, meeting her gaze. There was no anger in her eyes, no resentment, just understanding. "You're not the same person you were this morning," she said. "None of us are." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know." She exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" He looked back at the woman and the little girl, then back at the bride. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I think I need to find out." The bride studied him for a long moment before giving him a small nod. "Then that's what you should do." She wasn't angry. She wasn't heartbroken. She had come into this wedding believing she knew exactly what her future would be. But now she realized sometimes life had other plans. The groom stood, taking one last look at the place where everything had changed. Then he turned to the woman and the little girl. "Let's go." As they walked out together, the night air wrapped around them like a promise. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in a long